The Pittsburgh Steelers are headed to the Combine, as am I. But here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, we're going to break a few things down, and it's Mock Draft Monday, so we'll pick a winner and talk about all the things the Steelers are going to be looking at in the Combine. Well, let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting platform and app, as well as YouTube. If you watch this video on YouTube, hit the like button of the video if you enjoyed. Hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day because we're your team every day. Now, I record this going into Monday, but on Monday, I will be traveling to Indianapolis and staying there throughout the week for the NFL Combine. This is my first Combine that I'll be have covered on hand, and I'm going to be recording from my hotel room in there. So expect the rest of the week to go accordingly. You can also follow me on Twitter at Carter Critiques, where I'll probably be live tweeting things that I see, hear, talk about with players that we get to talk to at the podium, things like that. It's going to be a good experience, but we'll also get to talk to Omar Khan with the Steelers, get more insights there. It's going to be a fun week to learn about that kind of things. But one thing that the more and more I have spent time studying this class that confirms where I've been kind of seeing the strength of this upcoming draft class is that I really think that the Steelers are in a prime position to take advantage of a draft class that is fairly deep, especially in the top 100 players department. Daniel Jeremiah, a known draft expert, talked with people across the country and sports media this past weekend, and he confirmed what a lot of other people have been saying and thinking, including myself, that this draft class has the potential to have many starters strewn throughout it in the top 3 rounds of this draft class. Because you look at the cornerbacks, you look at the linemen on both sides of the ball, you look at the tight ends, you look at the running backs. There's a lot of positions that truly look deep. Edge rusher also looks really deep in this draft class. And it's going to be interesting to see how different teams try to capitalize on it. There will be wild moves. There's talks about all 4 quarterbacks going in the top 10 this year. Of course, CJ Stroud, Bryce Young being the obvious one, but Will Levis from Kentucky. And now there's talk about Richardson from Florida bumping up to there. So this is kind of a new thing that I've been every year. I try to put together my list of players that I can expect to not see fall to the Steelers. And a lot of times, like in the year when they traded up to get Devin Bush, there's a position where if the Steelers really want a player that they know they're not going to get, sometimes it means they're going to have to trade up. And again, Devin Bush didn't work out in the long run, but at the time, and even the first 2 years of doing it, made a lot of sense because he was answering a lot of questions at inside linebacker and filling a hole left by the unfortunate injury that ended Ryan Shazier's career. So the question is then, is it worth trading day 2 capital, which is ultimately what you'd be giving up, to move up from 17? And I think it would be a waste of the opportunity to capitalize on those picks and getting multiple players who fit in necessary roles and holes in this roster right now and could position the team for the near future where they're going to have key starters who perform well on rookie contracts if they're able to draft well and hit on their picks with their 4 picks in the top 80 and 3 in the top 50. Remember, of course, the Steelers traded with the Bears. They gave up Chase Claypool. They got the Bears' natural second-round pick that ended up being the 32nd overall pick because the Bears finished with the worst record and the Dolphins forfeited their draft pick. So now the Steelers do have the first overall pick of the second round. Now, last week with Wes Euler, we talked about the potential of trading up and trading down in the first round and things like that. And we looked at the potential of trading up with that 32nd overall pick into the first round. But something we talked about with Alan Saunders on the show was also the potential of holding on to that 32nd overall pick and then waiting to see what happens if people start to panic over the 24-hour period in between the end of the first round and the start of the second, when teams are looking around and saying, oh man, this player's still on the board, we got to go get him. And then maybe Omar Khan's phone blows up and they can get more day 2 picks. Because for me, that's where I see the sweet spot of this draft class. And it doesn't mean that Steelers should give up their first round pick to get multiple day 2 picks, even if they may feel that that's the move. I still think you keep your first round pick and you get first round guys. It's always good to have guys on 5-year deals that you'll have, especially if you hit and they're guys that you want to keep around. But I think that if anything, right now with this draft class, and I want to get to this in the next segment about who you can eliminate from basically being there. I think that one thing that you're looking with this draft class is that the need to move up, I don't think is as valuable as the need to make sure to protect or improve upon the day 2 picks the Steelers have at 32nd, 49, and 80 that they have in this draft class. Because right now you look at the options that they have. Let's say in the first round, they get either an offensive tackle, a cornerback, a defensive lineman, or a linebacker, those all being like the top positions of need. I know some people out there want wide receiver. I think that that's one that they can really wait on. I also think every year there's a really good wide receiver class because it's just a position that gets a lot of talent in today's football world. But I think the biggest answer that you can get right now is whatever position that you hit in the first round, the other positions are going to be fine to draft in the second, third, and third rounds, especially. And that's not something you can say every year. That's why the Steelers traded up for Devin Bush back in 2019, because it was deemed the 2 only ready linebackers they thought that year were Devin White and Devin Bush. And turned out not to be the case. But going into the draft class, those were the guys who were seen with the speed and the ability to defend the run and simultaneously defend the pass. And that's what the Steelers were looking for, was a playmaker who could do both. And that if the Steelers had waited until their pick, Devin Bush would not have been there. And then they would have missed out on the opportunity again at linebacker to get a guy like that. And then they would have been lacking at that position for another year. So there are years when you're in a position where that's the biggest need. And again, the Steelers were in a different position at that point in time. We're talking 2019. So they've just finished the 2018 season, and they still had Ben Roethlisberger. They weren't going to have Antonio Brown anymore. But they still had Ben Roethlisberger. They thought they were going to have for the next year. They still had a young TJ Watt developing. They still had Cam Hayward, Stephon Tuitt. They had a lot of pieces that reasonably made them think, hey, if we can just fill this spot here and this spot here. Joe Hayden was still a key factor for that team. If they could have just filled those spots, they thought, hey, this could make us the Super Bowl champion team and put it all together. And of course, that didn't happen. Ben Roethlisberger injures his elbow in week 2 and misses the whole season. They trade for Minka Fitzpatrick, and that's a big part of how we got here today. But they were making those trades because they were trading up then because they wanted to fill a specific spot on the roster that they thought would complete their roster and put them in position to compete for a Super Bowl, get back into making a Super Bowl run after missing the playoffs in 2018. Of course, that didn't happen with all the things that went on, but this is a different team now. This is a young team that they're building up assets on. And whereas, yes, it'd be great to get some of the better assets out there, I think right now the Steelers are in a position where they should feel very comfortable in a deep class like this one, waiting it out, being patient, and getting their guys at their spots, or even trading back to get more guys from a class that I truly think, if they can get as much as they can out of the top 100, this could be the year that the Steelers get 3 or 4 starters out of this draft class who contribute very quickly. I'll give you more thoughts on my specifics of who that could be in the different positions across this NFL scouting combine, this NFL draft class. And of course, we will have our mock draft winner in a little bit here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. So don't go anywhere. But first, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsor, because this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel Sportsbook, of course, is the #1 sportsbook in America. And now that the NBA season is back off and running, they're here to offer you the no-sweat first bet, which gives you the chance to get up to $1,000 in bonus bets back if you don't win on your first bet on NBA games. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to threes drained, and FanDuel lets you make player prop bets that give you so many options. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with same-game parlays. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're continuing rolling up and getting this ready for the Combine. So again, one thing I think about the Combine that's coming up is it's always cool to see who's the fastest and who's that, but it's always important to keep an eye on the guys who are going to be raising their profiles or confirming their profiles by filling out who they are. Now, we can forget about the easy guys that everyone talks about all the time. Will Anderson, Jalen Carter, those guys are gone. And the quarterbacks, those don't need to be the ones that are on your radar. Now, I do think it's interesting to see where offensive tackles will end up, because there's a hodgepodge of who thinks who's the best in this class. Some people think it's Paris Johnson Jr. Some people think it's Broderick Jones. Some people think it's Peter Skorinski. It's all over the place. And, I think it's going to be interesting to see who ends up being the guy that gets taken off the board first, but also how many of those offensive linemen are off the board by the time the Steelers pick, because I look at how the board's shaping out. Again, you got Will Anderson, Jalen Carter, Myles Murphy, Tyree Wilson, guys like that. I do expect to be gone. That's four big defensive names that'll be off the board early. I also think that there might be merit to the idea of 4 quarterbacks going off the board early. So if you get those guys off the board, that's 8 total players. 8 of the 16. So that's half of the picks that you need to account for before the Steelers come up. I think it's possible a Quentin Johnson or maybe even a Jordan Addison go in the top 16. And so maybe you're talking about 2 wide receivers. But then, of course, cornerback comes into play. And that's where, we've been talking about Christian Gonzalez and Devin Witherspoon, 2 guys who I think are the 1A and 1B of this draft class. But if we look at this draft class and we see some of the cornerbacks here, this could be the opportunity for guys to rise up the ranks. Guys like Joey Porter Jr., if he ran well, it'd be very interesting to see what he did for his profile. Guys like Kelly Ringo of Georgia, Cam Smith of South Carolina, Clark Phillips, Emmanuel Forbes. All of these guys are kind of below that 1A, 1B group. I'd say Joey Porter could certainly put himself in that top class with that concern, or with a kind of a really good combine. But those guys that I was mentioning there, especially Ringo, Clark Phillips III, Emmanuel Forbes, Kyle Blue Kelly, those guys I think could improve their stock to being first rounders or kind of keep themselves in that second to third round range there. But this could also make it very interesting to see how they do. And if they don't climb up the boards, and again, there's too many positions out there for everyone to always pick cornerback. This could give the Steelers the chance to get their guy at 32 and, put them in a situation where maybe they're getting some good phone calls, but maybe the guy that they really want is sitting right there in front of them and they want to take him, and that being, one of those cornerbacks there. But here's the thing. Again, if at the combine any of these guys blow up, it's going to change how we're talking about them, how they're perceived across the NFL. We're going to see a bunch of rankings shift over time, and then we're also going to hear how interviews went, and that's when we start to see which teams are feeling which players. That's when we start to actually get more insight into how these players are going to pan out in this draft class here. Especially, it's the relationships. Another guy I think to be on the lookout for is Julius Brents, Kansas State cornerback, who I really loved in the Senior Bowl. I thought he did very good. Another cornerback, Deonte Banks. Some people have him as a first rounder, but he's another guy. If he runs well, if he shows up well in the combine, he could put himself as maybe a guy the Steelers could consider with that 32nd overall pick. Again, I'm naming a lot of names here for the cornerback position, but also you look at linebacker. I'd be very interested to see how guys like Trenton Simpson, Drew Sanders, Noah Sewell, and Jack Campbell do. Also, Deion Henley and DeMarvion Overshown. Those are all guys I'm really interested to see how they play at linebacker, or how, not just how they play, but how they run at linebacker and how they perform in these drills to kind of form, okay, where will linebacker go in this draft class? Because linebacker is still very much a need, even though it's funny. We were just talking about Devin Bush on this show and the need to get him then. That need still exists to this day. I still think the Steelers need to do something with Miles Jack's contract because he's getting a lot of money for good play, but it hasn't been great play. Part of that's been injury. Part of that's just, I think he just, it was also dealing with the Steelers situation. But if they can get a young linebacker who can be a playmaker, I think that's another thing that's going to be valued there. But if Trenton Simpson, who looks on tape to be just this explosive weapon missile that can be aimed anywhere all over the field, he could be a guy that goes in the first round. There's some draft simulators that look at him and say, hey, you know what? We're putting him in the mid-first round before the Steelers even get a chance to pick him off the board at 17th overall. It's going to depend on how this stuff plays out. But again, you look at guys like Deion Henley, who had a really good Senior Bowl as well. DeMarvion Overshown, who I talked to Alan Saunders about on this very show just last week, about how explosive he is and how well he moves around the field. And even though he's lighter, he is, he's 6'4". He's got the ability to, be a linebacker with a little bit of length and with the speed to kind of fly over the field. Those type of guys can move the web and be guys that the Steelers keep their eyes on with those day 2 picks and get real answers to positions that they need solutions in. You also go to edge rushers, because I still think a goal for the Steelers in this draft class should be to find a legitimate third option behind TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith. And maybe, as I said before on this show, maybe the answer is Bud Dupree and getting a rookie. But if they can't afford a Bud Dupree, or if Bud Dupree doesn't get cut by the Titans, there's guys in this draft class who could be very interesting to look at later on. I'm not sure if I'd get an edge rusher at the first or second round picks, but I would be looking at maybe in the third round and see if a Zach Harrison from Ohio State, a 6'6", 272-pound edge rusher, see where he's at. Byron Young of Tennessee, KJ Henry of Clemson. All of those guys, I think can fit the mold of being the guy that plays edge, can be a little bit more physical while also being a little bit more athletic on the edge, and fit into what the Steelers are trying to do. And all those guys, again, none of them rejected to be first-round guys. They're all guys that could be 32nd, 49, some of them maybe even the 80th pick. And you go up, look up these guys' tape, look up the way that they're able to make plays, and you can see that man, like, these are quality guys that the Steelers were to add at edge rusher. That's a position where you don't have to rush them. They could be brought in sparingly, a lot like how Alex Highsmith was brought in when the Steelers had TJ Watt and they knew they weren't going to be able to pay Bud Dupree. And eventually Alex Highsmith worked his way up, became a starter, and it worked out that way. But I really think that the Steelers need to be preparing that guy now, so that whenever TJ Watt does get hurt again, they're prepared for to have a rotation that can still be effective. We talked about offensive tackle. One guy I think everyone's going to be looking at is Anton Harrison out of Oklahoma. He's a guy who's in that next echelon of offensive tackles in this class, along with Dawand Jones, Darnell Wright, and Matthew Bergeron. Those guys, how does their combine go? Do they raise some eyebrows? This is, again, going back to my point. I'm naming all these names, and if you're a draftnik, or if you're a Steelers fan who's been doing the mock drafts, you've seen these names. These are names you've seen floating around. Imagine getting. I just went through 4 different positions, and I didn't even get to interior offensive linemen like Osiris Torrence, John Michael Schmitz, Cody Mauch, Andrew Voorhees, Steve Avila, who's risen really quickly from TCU up the interior offensive lineman ranks, Luke Weipler out of Ohio State. All these positions, all these guys we're talking about here are reasonable guys that if the Steelers are patient, they can get any number of them across the different positions. They can't get all of them, but they're going to have their shots to get these different guys. And a lot of these prospects, and it's different than most years. Oftentimes when you get to that, there's years where you get to that 5th or 6th player of a player group in an NFL draft class. you're not as confident when you're picking those guys because now the first guys have been off the board. You're not sure how deep a class runs, and then you have to hope you get lucky. Like, for example, a lot of Steelers fans often say, why didn't the Steelers just take Creed Humphrey? Well, Creed Humphrey was the 14th offensive lineman selected in that draft class. Yes, there was hope that he'd be very good, and I thought he'd be very good. If you followed this show, I was one of the people that said, like, I think that he'd be a really good pick in the second round. Turned out he would have been, but the Steelers went with Pat Freiermuth. So it happens. But I think this is a draft class where you can have the confidence that you'll be able to find guys like that in multiple position groups. Tight end's another one of them. We look at tight end, we see guys like Michael Mayer from Notre Dame, but also if you look around, I think it's going to be really interesting to see where Darnell Washington of Georgia goes in this draft class, because tight end is such a deep position. Some people are looking at this group and saying, like, hey, you know what? That could be the group that makes the biggest difference here. There's also Luke Musgrave of that group, and there's been a really interesting proposition by a lot of fans out there. What if the Steelers, instead of going and getting a wide receiver or doubling down and getting 2 offensive linemen in this draft class, I think everyone agrees that they need at least one from their top guys. They get a blocking tight end, and there are more blocking tight ends in this draft class, like Darnell Washington and like Michael Mayer. So I look at how these guys play out, and it just further affirms the Steelers and Omar Khan need to play it smart and not get as aggressive with trying to go up the ladder on day one, and maybe necessarily protecting those day 2 picks at all costs. That's even why when I was going over the draft trade scenarios last week, you saw me trying to push, if they're trading that 32nd pick up to get into the first round, they're only giving up that 4th round pick to do so, because I don't think that they should give up either that second round pick or that 3rd round pick to with how strong this class is. But again, that's gonna be interesting to see how Omar Khan wants to handle it. This is gonna be his first run at being the full general manager in charge. Remember, it was Kevin Colbert who was finishing up the draft process that was going on all throughout last year. Now it's Omar Khan's turn, and we'll get to talk with Omar Khan on Tuesday. So you'll have my thoughts on that right here on this show after that happens on Tuesday. But we got to get to our Mock Draft Monday winner here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Don't think I forgot. Every weekend, I put out a post on my Twitter or on the Locked On Steelers Facebook group, and if you post your picks under it, you get a chance for me to talk about your picks if I like the way that you were thinking. We have a winner coming up in just a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. See if you won and hear my thoughts on those picks right after this. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're continuing our NFL Scouting Combine preview type of show here because I'm getting ready to head out there myself. But before we get into any of that, we do have to get into our winner of the Mock Draft Monday contest for February 27th here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Last week we had an interesting winner. This week we had another winner who, this was a plain draft of just picking who was there. I will say, moving forward, we'll start to have some themes in the next few ones. I'll probably say, hey, I want the best trade up draft, the best trade back draft, the best draft that drafts offensive lineman first, defensive lineman, or edge rusher or cornerback first. We're going to have different priorities just to give different exercises to see what Steelers fans come up with. But without further ado, this week's winner of the Mock Draft Monday contest was Dan Lasnik, who posted in our Locked On Steelers Facebook group. Last week we had a Twitter winner. This week we had a Facebook winner here on the show. And I wanted to highlight this because I thought that Dan did a really good job hitting on several key areas. One, getting offensive linemen out of the way so early with Broderick Jones from Georgia. Now, I got to admit, I'm starting to, the more I read and hear about people talking about Broderick Jones, I'm starting to think that he's not going to be on the board. Last week I even did a mock draft where I got Paris Johnson Jr. fell to me in the mock draft simulator. I was like, okay, I guess I'll take him. But that's that. But I like the idea of this is going to be a situation where we talked about, shouldn't Omar Khan trade down? Shouldn't he go get some other picks there? If we're talking about, we love the day 2 picks, but if you get a player like Broderick Jones, who I think he is in a very physical run blocking offensive tackle who can get sharper in pass protection and get sharper overall, but he looks like a true mauler at 6'4", 315. If you can get that guy at 17, you don't trade anywhere. You take him right away unless someone offers you a ransom. And I think that's got to be the focus here. And that's why I wanted to go with Dan's picks here, because again, he got that, and then immediately he made sure to address other positions that I thought were important. He got Deonte Banks, the cornerback out of Maryland, with the 32nd overall pick, and this is where you get interesting. Now, Andre Carter II out of Army as an edge rusher at 49. PFF loves that pick. I want to see more out of Andre Carter because I didn't like as much as what I saw in the in the Senior Bowl. But Senior Bowl doesn't always determine everything. So maybe he had a bad day there in the highlights that I was able to see. But certainly getting another edge rusher, and he would have plenty of time to learn behind TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith. And again, I advocated recently on the show for the Steelers to re-sign Alex Highsmith. Then he goes and double dips at cornerback to get a guy like Garrett Williams. And that is a very interesting move in my book. Garrett Williams is 6'6", Deonte Banks 6'1". You could play these guys, move these guys around. I think that's going to be very interesting to see how they would be able to fit into the secondary, because the Steelers, as we've talked about, they have Cameron Sutton. They don't have Cameron Sutton. We're thinking they're going to bring back Cameron Sutton because both sides apparently are really wanting to make a deal. That could be. I think it's just beneficial for both sides. Cam Sutton stays in the defense that he's been able to flourish in. The Steelers get back their key cornerback who's become a leader in the locker room for their guys. They keep Levi Wallace. We see what's up with Akella Witherspoon. We see what's up with William Jackson III. They bring back James Pierre because he's a restricted free agent. I think you can keep Levi Wallace and then decide about the other cornerbacks, what you want to do there. But that opens the room for getting rookie contracted cornerbacks added to your roster. And that's why I like that Dan got two of them, because if you can get two guys and you hit on one or you hit on both, your secondary becomes young, they become less expensive. And now you don't, because again, Levi Wallace's contract is up after this next season. You don't have to go shopping again too much and spending a whole lot. And because eventually you're going to start spending on some of those offensive players. Najee Harris, I know he's just entering his third year, but his fifth-year option is going to be coming around the corner soon, and you're going to want to be ready to not have to pay a boatload to get cornerbacks when you're trying to keep him, and then eventually keeping Kenny Pickett and Pat Freiermuth and guys like that on your offense. And that's where I think the Steelers need to kind of shore up some things and get younger on defense. That's also why I think defensive line could be a priority. And that's the one thing I will say about Dan's draft class, is that he doesn't have a pure defensive lineman. But you could say, hey, maybe they go get Larry Ogunjobi, maybe they go get some other guy, maybe DeMarvin Leal, really takes a step up this year and he starts to become a big option for them on the defensive line. But either way, I think that's important there. Again, Garrett Williams getting Michael Wilson, a wide receiver, with the 4th round pick. This to me is the sweet spot of this draft class to get a wide receiver, is that 120 range where the Steelers are at, because the Steelers, they could absolutely go get a wide receiver early, but they've done that enough over the years. I also think George Pickens and Deontay Johnson are fine 1-2 punch. I've been over this option before. I don't think they need to rush to that spot there. I'd be very interested to see guys like Puka Nacua, who was with BYU. He had a really big Senior Bowl week, I thought. But there's guys that I look at and I'm like, man, if they can find a way to put them on their roster with the 120th pick, I think that could be very interesting to see how the Steelers incorporate a wide receiver there. It doesn't need to be a superstar playmaker. It doesn't need to be the guy that wins the jump ball. It just needs to be a guy who's a solid route runner, can play in the slot or can play outside and you move someone else to the slot. But I don't think wide receiver necessarily needs to be an early pick, but that's why I like Dan picking wide receiver at 4. And then you got me really good here, Dan, by getting Servassier Dennis. You did your homework, because as a guy who covers Pitt for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Servassier Dennis is a prospect that I really like. He's one of those guys that if he has a really good combine, I know he got injured right before the Senior Bowl, so he wasn't able to play in the game, but he had a really good practice week. But Servassier Dennis is one of those guys that if he shows up, man, he could rise his draft stock and be someone that goes definitely earlier than the 7th or maybe even the 6th round, because he's a very smart player. He's shown that he can play on defense. He's shown that he can move around the defense. He played all 3 linebacker positions for Pitt during his career. He settled in the Mike position in their defense. I think Servassier Dennis would be a late round steal if the Steelers were able to get them. And Dan, getting him with one of the 7th round picks was really cool. Then he gets in Nick Saldiveri, a tackle from Old Dominion. I think it's good to just stick, just get a depth offensive lineman, see what happens with him. If it hits, great. If not, oh well. You spent a 7th round pick on an offensive lineman that didn't work out. Not so bad. But Servassier Dennis, I thought, was really good several pick. I can never get him to stick around for the Steelers pick whenever I'm doing these mock draft simulators. But again, kudos to you, Dan, and congratulations for being this Monday's mock draft Monday winner by getting Broderick Jones, Deontay Banks, Andre Carter, Garrett Williams, Michael Wilson, Servassier Dennis, and Nick Saldiveri. We'll have more mock draft Mondays all throughout the rest of the offseason. But NFL Combine is about to get started. So we'll have coverage right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Stay tuned with all of my discussion points here. We're going to be at the Combine. I'll be there. I have a setup that I'm trying to make sure it's ready to go so that we'll still have the same kind of recording quality from the hotel room that I have in Indianapolis. But again, I'm Chris Carter. Hope that you enjoyed this show. Hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the shows where I'm at the NFL Scouting Combine, along with several other Locked On podcasts who will be in town. It's going to be interesting to unite with a lot of guys, reunite with my guy Q, who I've done. You see me do Friday shows with him every week on Locked On NFL, but also with plenty of the hosts that we've had on this show that we've only kind of done work virtually. So that's going to be very exciting. We hope that you stick around with us. So stick with us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. You can also read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where I cover all things Pitt athletics. And of course, you can find this show, the Locked On Steelers podcast, on your favorite podcasting platform and app. You can also find this show on YouTube. Like the video if you subscribed on YouTube. If you liked the video, if you enjoyed it on YouTube, subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes. I'll be back tomorrow with more on your Pittsburgh Steelers from the NFL Scouting Combine this week.